welcome back. So at this point, we should have had a nice tour. I'd call it a basic tour of all the different body systems we have in our body. Now we're going to start focusing in on just one of those body systems. You might be able to argue it is the most important body system in your body, and that is going to be the nervous system. And so the nervous system is talking about your brain, your spinal cord, and all the nerves that you have throughout your body. Now, the reason why I say you could argue this is the most important system in your body is because your brain controls the rest of you. This is the control center up in here. This is where all the thoughts come from. This is where all the signals come from that you need in order to properly run your body. And then at the end of this, we're going to be talking about a concept called homeostasis. I will come back to that at that point in time. So, nervous system, here we go. All right, so first up, your nervous system is organized into two different sections. So I'm talking physical sections in your body. You have what is called the central nervous system, and then you have the peripheral nervous system. So central nervous system is central. Central means in the middle. So that means the central nervous system is in the middle of you. So it's talking about your brain and your spinal cord specifically. It can also be abbreviated as CNS for central nervous system. The other part of your nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. And so that's going to be the rest of your body. Any nerves you have that are like in your arms, in your like body cavity, your midsection, your legs, any of that, that's the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral means outside. So like peripheral vision is what you see on the outside, not directly in front of you. And so for the peripheral nervous system, this is what we call, or it's made out of sensory and motor neurons, or motor nerves. So sensory nerves would be the nerves that we gather information with using our five senses. So you have nerves for sight, nerves for smell, nerves for sound, taste, and touch. Those are your five senses, and all the nerves that we use to gather that information from our five senses, those would be sensory nerves. We also have motor nerves. So motor is for movement. So our motor nerves connect to our muscles, and that is what tells us to move in certain ways. I'm going to start with the central nervous system. And so let's talk about the brain. So right here, you can definitely see a diagram of the brain, and it is color-coded into its different sections right here. Keep in mind, evolutionarily, all organisms started with this lower brain here, or the brain stem. And then as we evolved, not we, but like organisms in general, as evolution took place, different parts of the brain, like the cerebellum, evolved. And then this cortex up here started to evolve. And so one of the things that makes humans so different from any other species and any other animal is our frontal lobe over here, or our frontal cortex. And it's just because it's a lot larger than any other animal or any other species. And this is actually what helps us do our critical thinking and our problem solving much better than any other species out there. So let's take a step back. Your brain, like I alluded to, is your main processing center. Okay, so like I said, this is where all the information goes to. This is where the information is processed. And then this is where the decision is made to what to do with that information. So you have something happening in your environment. Your sensory neurons pick it up. They send that information to your brain. Your brain says, oh, this is what's going on. Let me react to it. And it sends that message back out to your motor neurons to have that physical reaction. Now, the brain is made out of three main parts. That is going to be the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So we talked about the brainstem. This is the most basic functioning part of the brain. We have the cerebellum, which adds in some higher level functioning, and I'll again come back to each one. And then the cerebrum is this entire area right here. And That's what starts to make us different from other animals and different from other species. So let us start with the brain stem. So I'm starting at the bottom here. Oh, why are things popping up always? So the brain stem, like I said, controls your basic body functions. So your heart rate, how fast your heart is beating. It controls how fast you're breathing. It controls your body temperature. So we should all be around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And it controls your sleep. So it tells your body when to wake up and when to go to sleep. So these are all just basic body functions that we need in order to survive. Now, when we move up to the cerebellum right here, so I'm looking at this middle part right here, the cerebellum starts to add in coordination and balance. So you could think about this too as a connection between this higher level functioning and this basic level functioning. So it coordinates those two things together because we have wants and needs to go do certain things, but we need coordination and balance in order to do that. So the cerebellum is actually why we're able to do things like pat our head and rub our stomach at the same time. So coordinates movement and balance. Now, moving up to this part right here, the cerebrum, and this would be your highest level thinking, highest level operation. So this part of the brain has a lot of stuff packed into it. So it controls learning. And learning is a very complex task. We have to take in information, we have to process that information, we have to make sense of that information, and we have to store it in our memory. So it controls your thought processes too. So just, what you want on a minute-to-minute basis, or if you're trying to make a decision, if you are doing any critical thinking or making decisions. It controls your memory, which I alluded to with learning, and it also controls your sensory function. So this is where all our sensory information actually goes into the brain. So let's break down this picture just a little bit for the cerebrum. This right here, the temporal lobe, it can be slightly different depending if you're on the right side or the left side of the brain, but it does control language, speech, music, and it also integrates all those things together. If you go into the middle of the brain down here, so if we're looking at it from the side, if you go inside the brain, this is also where memory can be stored, and it's also a connection between the right side and the left side. Back here, this purple section, the occipital lobe, this is your vision area of the brain. So this is where all the images your eyes pick up are brought to in the brain, and your brain makes sense of it here and, passes that information along to other parts of the brain. Now, this area of the brain, so the parietal lobe, along with part of what we're calling the frontal lobe over here, because it's all in red, this area over here is what controls movement and touch sensory. So if you are taking in different senses from touching stuff, it's all going into this section right here. And then you also have what's called a motor cortex right next to it. So that makes sense because, like I said, we take in information with our senses, our brain makes sense of it, and then we have to send that signal out to create some sort of movement. And then up here in the frontal lobe, this is really where the magic happens. So this is where your personality is, decision making, social interaction, critical thinking, all of those higher level processes, planning stuff, thinking about a future versus a past versus a present, all of those higher level thinking happens in our frontal lobe here. And then I'm going to play this video. So we're going to talk about it for a second afterwards, but there was this guy named Phineas Gage. It was in the 1800s. He was a railroad worker. So his job was actually to lay the train tracks for a train. And his job was very dangerous. There was an explosion one day, and basically he got a metal rod through his head and through his brain. And so keep in mind that in order to study the brain, in order to learn about it, we'd have to like go into people's heads and poke around and figure out what's going on. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't volunteer to have someone cut my head open and poke around in my brain. So the way that we're able to study the brain and learn about the brain is from accidents happening to the brain. And this was one of the first recorded accidents in history that we have to start learning about how our brain works.
Back in 1848, there was a pretty ordinary man who had an extraordinary accident. You've probably heard of Phineas Gage, the railroad foreman who had a 1-meter iron rod blasted through his skull. The details are pretty graphic. Think bits of brains and skull going everywhere. This is my friend Anna from Grow Science, who's here to take you through all the gory details.
Part of Gage's job constructing railroads was to sprinkle dynamite into blasting holes. One afternoon, he tamped the iron rod down into a hole filled with dynamite, and it blasted off into his head. It passed through his left cheek, behind his left eye, through his frontal lobe, and out the top of his head, landing 8 meters away. Medical records suggest he was conscious for the entire time. He went to see a physician who stuck his fingers on either side of the wound to pick out pieces of loose brain and skull. But it wasn't so clear-cut. His brain developed a fungal infection, and his physician had to puncture tissue in Gage's nose to drain the wound.
Okay, another view. Miraculously, Gage survived this massive head injury and he appeared normal. He could still talk, walk, and function as he did before. But those who knew him said Gage was no longer Gage. He was rude and impatient. The rod had penetrated his frontal lobes, responsible for higher mental functions like social behavior and planning. And Gage could have had what we now know as frontal lobe disorder. Although we don't have a lot of evidence about Gage's story. Only a few doctors' reports are published in medical journals. Some say his behavioral changes are grossly exaggerated. But those medical reports did contribute to modern neurology. They supported emerging theories that our cerebral functions were localized and that certain conditions could be linked to brain damage. More recent study in people with brain lesions suggests that the orbital frontal lobe, part of Gage's brain that was damaged, is super important in decision making. And in 2012, researchers reconstructed scans of Gage's 189-year-old skull to show that most damage was to his frontal lobe. But the passage of the rod would have interrupted the connectivity of many different brain areas, making Gage's behavioral changes similar to those suffering from Alzheimer's disease. But brain injuries don't just come from trauma, they can come from diseases too. Check out Grow Science.
All right, so I'm going to stop the video there. Let's talk about what we just watched. I think there's one more thing. Nope, just kidding. Okay, let's go back. So we watched this video about this man named Phineas Gage. He was alive in 1848. That's when his accident happened. Now, his accident caused this metal rod to, like they said, go behind his cheekbone, behind his eye, and through his brain up through the front of his head. And so, like they mentioned, he was walking around with this metal rod like through his head. So he was fully conscious, he was aware, he was awake of what's going on. He just didn't really know that he had a metal rod in his head. So obviously they rushed him to the hospital. They removed the rod. Like they said, he got treatment for it. He recovered from it. But what they noticed were that there were certain changes in Mr. Phineas Gage. Now, those changes were in his frontal cortex here, his frontal lobe. And what they mentioned was he had trouble with decision making. He had trouble socializing. They said that he was impatient and rude to people. They said he had trouble planning stuff. And so those things all contribute to our personality. And it also shows us, like they mentioned, that this area of the brain that got injured probably has a lot to do with those types of functions. So by looking at different examples of accidents that happen to people's brains, we can learn a lot about the brain and how it works and how it functions. So let's talk about the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is what connects the brain to the rest of the body. So think about it like that intermediate middleman level of taking in information, passing it to the brain processes it, sends it back out, and the spinal cord shuttles that information off to where it needs to go in the peripheral nervous system in the body. So if you look at the organization of the spinal cord right here, it's color-coded, but it's also showing you that depending on the location of the spinal cord, it has different functions. So the top of the spinal cord, the part that's like up in your neck, in your head, in your like upper back shoulder area, that's going to control all the stuff that's also localized in that area. So it's going to control your head and neck movement. It's going to control your diaphragm, which has to do with breathing. It's located like right under your ribs. It's going to control what's called your deltoids and biceps, so your shoulders and this muscle right here in your arm that you use to bend your elbow. It controls your wrist extenders, so this muscle right here you use to move your wrist around. It controls your triceps, which is this muscle here you use to straighten your elbow, and it controls your hand movement. So all this stuff is sort of in the top of your body. Now, as you move down the spinal cord right here, it starts controlling chest muscles and abdominal muscles. So it's controlling this middle part of your body. And then as we move down here, we get into leg muscles. And then as we move down even more, it controls your bowels and your bladder. So going pee and going poo. So it's a very organized system. The other thing about the spinal cord is that it also controls your reflexes. So this is when like you're at the doctor's office and you're sitting on the table and the doctor hits your knee with a hammer and your knee kicks out and you're like, that feels weird. So that would be a reflex. A reflex is a signal that never actually makes it to the brain. So when the doctor hits your knee with the hammer, it hits a sensory nerve. That sensory nerve sends the signal to your spinal cord. Your spinal cord takes that signal, sends it back out to a motor nerve, and causes your leg to kick out. It never goes to the brain. The same idea happens when you put your hand on a hot pan. Have you ever noticed that, like, if you are going to burn yourself, so maybe girls tend to use like a hair straightener on their hair that gets really hot, or like a curling iron. But if you do end up burning yourself, usually what happens, if you notice, you remove your hand from the heat and then you start to feel the pain afterwards. So that idea of my hand's on a hot pan and I quickly remove it from the hot pan, that's a reflex. You actually feeling the pain, that part of the signal has to go up to your brain and back down. That's why there's a little bit of a delay in the movement away from the hot object before you feel the pain from burning yourself. All right, so before we get into the peripheral nervous system, so sensory neurons and motor neurons, we have to talk about what a neuron actually is. Now, your body is made out of this thing called cells. It's sort of the basic organization to your body. And so I just want to make sure we get all the information on the screen. Basically, a neuron is a specialized cell for your nervous system. So your brain is made out of neurons, your spinal cord is made out of neurons, and then your sensory and motor neurons are made out of neurons. Yes, I'm going to go with that. All right, so I just want to make sure you can see this picture down here too. This is an idea of what a neuron can actually look like. This is, more of a cartoon version of what it's going to look like. So within the neuron, there are different parts of the neuron that help us talk about how it's able to transmit a signal. Now, what I should say is the entire job of the neuron is to pass these signals from one place to another. Like I said, we have sensory neurons, so they take in information. So they have to pass that signal to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is made out of neurons. They have to take that signal, pass it to the brain. The brain has to take that signal and process it, so it's sending it around to all these different places. And then the brain has to take that signal, send it back out to your spinal cord and back out to your motor neurons. So let's look at how a neuron is actually put together, the structure of a neuron, because it will help us understand how that signal is sent. Now, like I said, this is a cell in your body, so it's itty bitty tiny. You would need a microscope to see it. There are some neurons in your body. I find this fascinating. There are some neurons in your body that are super, super long. So for example, you have a neuron that it originates in your spinal cord down at the bottom of your spinal cord, and it kind of goes all the way down through your hip, down your leg, all the way down to your foot. It's like feet long. So it's like a very long neuron, but it's just very, very tiny. But if you cut that, you basically lose function to your leg. So anyway, with the neuron here, the main body of the neuron is called the soma. So that's going to be this area right in here. Now, attached to the soma are these things called dendrites. That's these little like branchy looking things over here. So if we're looking at this picture, all of these right here, these would be your dendrites. This would be your soma right here. And then you have what is called the axon. That's going to be this tail that is being covered right now. So this tail right here, once I stop moving the mouse, and that axon is attached to what we call terminal buttons, which are these endpoint branches over here. Now, along the axon, you can see these like little bubble looking things over here. Again, I'll stop moving the mouse so you can see it all. But those little bubble things are called a myelin sheath, and they're made of what we call Schwann cells, and they just wrap around the axon to insulate it. So basically, the neuron works because it sends an electrical signal from dendrites to terminal buttons. So the signal is always going to originate here. This neuron is going to intake the signal from the dendrites, bring it into the soma. It's going to travel along the axon to the terminal buttons. And this is all an electrical signal. So literally electricity, like when you plug a wire into the wall, same type of electricity. Now, what you'll notice about wires is that they are all insulated with that plastic stuff. So if we take a wire here, for example, here's just a wire. It's for the mouse that I'm using, right? It's insulated with this plastic coating around it. If I peeled it back, you'd be able to see the wire inside. The reason why we insulate the wires is because it helps the signal travel faster. So what this means is we have very quick reactions. It's not like somebody throws us a ball and we're like, wait a second, is it coming? Is it coming? Boom, hits us in the face. It's someone throws us a ball, we catch it. That signal is sent quick as lightning because it's electricity. And so in order to talk about how that signal is sent, we of course have to know the different parts of the neuron so we can better talk about it together. All right, so this is getting into the bigger question of, like I said, how are neurons able to pass messages or signals between the brain and the rest of the body? So like I mentioned, it's an electrical signal within the neuron itself. But our neurons are connected to many other neurons in our body. So how do we pass the message from one neuron to the next neuron? Think about this like a game of telephone. So that game you played probably as a little kid, someone comes up with a message, you whisper that message into the person beside you ear, they pass that message around, and you pass the message around to the group and see if it comes out the same at the end. Neurons are very similar to that, but they make less mistakes. So like I said, inside a single neuron is an electrical signal from dendrites to terminal buttons. So dendrites, soma, axon, terminal buttons. Now, between neurons, that space between the neurons, so between the terminal buttons of the first neuron and the dendrites of the second neuron, that space is called a synapse. So if you look at this picture right here, we can see terminal buttons of the first neuron connecting to dendrites of the second neuron. And we've zoomed in on that connection to right here. So this would be the terminal buttons of the first neuron. This would be the dendrites of the second neuron. And this space in between is what we call the synapse. So step number one, a nerve is a series of neurons connected together like a chain. That's what we talked about, that game of telephone. So this entire thing would be a nerve. A single is called a neuron. Number 2, a nerve passes an electrical signal from dendrites to terminal button. That's what we discussed. So from dendrites all the way down the axon to the terminal buttons is an electrical signal. You don't necessarily need to know how that electrical signal is sent. You just have to know that it's electricity passing from dendrites to terminal buttons. Number 3, at the terminal button, the electric signal triggers the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter. So basically it's saying right here is our terminal button, and these little dots in here, so either the red ones, the yellow ones, it looks like we have orange ones too. These are those chemicals called a neurotransmitter. It's a chemical signal. So neuro, we're talking about our brain and our nervous system. Transmitter is usually to transmit or to move, to pass along information. So we are passing along a chemical information right here. Now, what happens is, like it says, it triggers the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter. So once the electrical signal hits the terminal buttons, these chemicals, these neurotransmitters, are released out of the terminal button into the synapse. I warned you guys, biology is full of vocabulary. So number 4, it says when the neurotransmitter contacts the dendrite of the second neuron, it triggers an electrical signal. So basically, once these red neurotransmitters move across the synapse, they eventually are able to connect with the dendrites of that second neuron in the nerve. And that connection signals the neuron to start its electrical signal to go from dendrites to terminal button. And then number 5, the signal passes from the dendrite to the terminal button and the process repeats. So basically, inside the neuron, we send an electrical signal. Across the synapse, we send a chemical signal using neurotransmitters. And then we take that chemical signal, convert it back to an electrical signal, and send it again along the second neuron. And this process just repeats. So one way to help you think about this, like that telephone game I mentioned, us as individuals, we would be the neurons. So that means that we are sending that electrical signal inside of us between hearing the message and wanting to speak the message to the next person. That is your electrical signal. The actual whispering of the message to the next person would be how you pass that neurotransmitter, that chemical signal, across the synapse to the next neuron. And so once you make it around the circle in the telephone game, that would be an entire nerve or entire nervous signal. So this video is meant to help you better understand and visualize how neurons are actually passing their signals. So they're passing that electrical signal within the neuron, and then they're passing that chemical signal between neurons in that synapse, that space between them. Also, it's going to talk about the difference between a reflex arc versus the full nervous impulse.
How does the pain you experience when you burn your hand result so quickly in an action by your muscles? Many animals respond to environmental stimuli using specialized cells called neurons. A stimulus is detected by sensory receptors, and the body responds through motor effectors. These cells working together allow you to respond very quickly to threats. When you touch something hot, heat receptors of a sensory neuron detect the stimuli and send the information of heat to an interneuron in your central nervous system. From there, a motor neuron sends a response from your central nervous system to the skeletal muscles in your arm, causing them to contract and pull your hand away. The fundamental process of neural transmission that underlies this action occurs in all neurons of the body. Neurons transmit this information through changes in the electrical potential of the membrane by the movement of ions across the membrane. An electrochemical gradient governs the movement of these ions, resulting in an electrical impulse. The resting membrane potential in a neuron, when the cell is not firing an impulse, is established by the unequal distribution of sodium ions outside of the cell and potassium ions inside the cell, making the outside of the cell more positively charged compared to the inside. The electrochemical gradient is established and maintained by an enzyme called sodium-potassium ATPase. When a neuron is stimulated, sodium ion channels open and sodium ions flow into the cell. This leads to a change in the electrical potential across the membrane called depolarization. The depolarizing electrical potential travels down the dendrites and over the cell body. Multiple electrical potentials will combine at the axon hillock in a process called summation. If the depolarization is large enough, an action potential is triggered. Action potentials are all or none electrical impulses that maintain their amplitude and strength down the length of the axon. The action potential travels down the axon when the depolarization of an area of membrane causes adjacent voltage-gated sodium ion channels to open. The influx of sodium ions results in membrane depolarization along the membrane. After a short delay, potassium ion channels open and potassium ions flow out, repolarizing the membrane. For the neuron to fire again, the resting membrane potential needs to be reestablished. Sodium-potassium ATPase is used to move sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradients, reestablishing the resting membrane potential. As the action potential moves down the axon, ions are diffusing only a short distance, allowing the signal to move quickly. At the axon terminal, the electrical impulse passes to another cell at a cellular connection called a synapse. The space between the presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic cell is called the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic neuron contains signal molecules called neurotransmitters that are packaged inside vesicles. When an action potential reaches the end of a neuron, neurotransmitters are released by exocytosis from the neuron into the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters bind to the adjacent cell at receptor sites attached to ion channels. The channels open, allowing the movement of ions into or out of the effector cell, which alters its membrane potential, thereby transmitting the signal from the neuron to the effector cell. Because nerve impulses move very rapidly down the axon of a neuron and move from cell to cell across synapses, you react quickly to a stimulus, like burning your finger.
I know I just threw a lot of information at you in that video. However, the takeaway I wanted you to get from it were those visuals of how that electrical impulse is sent within a neuron from dendrite to terminal button, and then how that chemical message is passed between the first neuron and the second neuron using neurotransmitters across the synapse. So now that we have talked about how neurons actually send a signal. So we have that electrical signal inside the neuron. We have that chemical signal between neurons in that space called a synapse. Now we're going to be talking about different types of neurons that you have in your body. So like I've mentioned before, you have sensory neurons and you have motor neurons. The only new type of neuron that I'm mentioning is called an interneuron. So let's break this down. And I have a picture down here to help you follow along. Apparently, I'm not going to be able to move my mouse, so this is awesome. But basically, sensory neurons, like I've alluded to, they collect information from the environment through one of your 5 senses. So anytime you touch something, those are sensory neurons collecting information from your environment. Like if I touch the camera up here, I can say, oh, this camera is nice and smooth. So that would be a sensory neuron. You can see things, that would be sensory neurons. Hear things, smell things, taste things. Those are all sensory neurons. Now, the sensory neuron takes in that information. So that would be in the diagram right here. It's saying we're looking at your eyeball. So a visual, a sight neuron. You're looking at, what is this, a glass of water. So your eyeball takes that information in with the sensory neuron, and it's going to pass it to what we call an interneuron. So that's these purple ones right here. So I'm going to come down to the interneuron for a second. Basically, this is your middleman. This is connecting the sensory neurons to eventually the motor neurons. So that means that your spinal cord and your brain are made out of what we call interneurons. Basically, like I said, it takes in that sensory information and it kind of passes it along to somewhere in your spinal cord or somewhere in your brain where that information needs to go. The interneurons also then, after your brain processes the sensory neuron information, it uses interneurons to send a signal back out into your body, into the peripheral nervous system to eventually, so if we follow the diagram right here, eventually make our way back down here to what we call a motor neuron. So the motor neuron just causes your muscles to contract so that we can create movement. So in this case, your motor neuron is going to connect to your arm muscles, which is going to cause you to grab the glass, pick it up, and take a drink. So that would be a full nervous impulse using all three types of neurons. So our sensory neurons take in the information, oh, I'm looking at a glass of water. The interneurons bring that information into your spinal cord, into your brain, where your brain can process it and say, you know what, I'm kind of thirsty. I want to reach for that water. So it uses interneurons to send that signal back out through your spinal cord and back into your peripheral nervous system to your motor neurons that will tell your muscles to contract in a certain way to grab that water and take a drink. So these three types of neurons, they all work together so that we can carry out all of our basic daily functioning, or even sometimes our higher level functioning. The same thing works in sports if you're going to be a professional athlete. All right, so we are going to stop here in terms of the nervous system. You will get some practice in it, but also please, please, please make sure that either as you are watching this video, or you can go back, look at the slide deck, rewatch this video, but you are also filling in your vocab notebook at the same time.